It's my great pleasure to introduce John Powell, who's a graduate student here at the University of Arizona. John came to us from ASU, where he pursued a whole line of investigation, which continues to this day with the Peeposh language and the Peeposh community, that's up there in Phoenix. He was a university fellow here at the University of Arizona. That's a very highly prestigious program in which only 20 PhD students each year are selected for it. And we're pleased to say that he has affiliated with a bunch of different research groups here. I sort of wonder how he has time for everything. He's affiliated with the semantics group. He's worked on that project. He's worked with the Iranian group. And he, of course, has been working here on the Celtic group, where he's been pursuing studies linking geographies to linguistic patterns. And that's what he's going to talk about today. So with no further ado, John, take it away.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Those are very kind words. All right, let me go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Full screen it. And I'll just minimize everybody else's thumbnail. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, good deal. All right, so I'm going to be talking about geospatial analysis of Glasgow Gaelic speakers over the last two censuses that we have information for. Yeah, there we go. All right, so by way of introduction, just a rough sketch because, of course, these are all very familiar with the audience here, but we know Scottish Gaelic is a Celtic language. It's spoken in Scotland. And UNESCO and Nathan Locke have considered Gaelic as in the category of vulnerable. Gaelic has undergone a decrease of speakers over the last several centuries. And you can sort of see that pretty clearly from this table, where you have the column here with the descending years and the corresponding number of Gaelic speakers estimates when there's only estimates available, and then the fixed numbers for when there's census data. And then you can see that as a proportion of the total Scottish population, you can see that decreasing over time now to where we're sort of a little bit over 1% of reported Gaelic speakers in the country. So Scottish Gaelic has been undergoing language shift, and it's been overwhelmingly to English. And this is true even in the Gaeltacht, these are the traditional Gaelic homelands, which include the council areas of the Highlands, the Outer Hebrides, and Argyll and Bute. Those are sort of what's traditionally known as the Gaeltacht. And at least a concentration of speakers are still in that area, but they've been seeing a decrease over time as well. However, what's been noteworthy is that there's been a rise of Gaelic speakers in the cities, principally Glasgow, but you see it also in Edinburgh as well as Aberdeen. And even more noteworthy because these places have not been Gaelic speaking for centuries in the case of Glasgow, or ever in the case of Aberdeen and perhaps even Edinburgh. Previous literature has attributed this specific rise within the urban Gaelic speakers to one of two different possibilities, either a continuous migration from the traditional rural Gaelic homelands to the cities, or language revitalization, producing new speakers within the framework of Gaelic medium education, and I'll talk about that in a sec. So keep these two in mind. These two sources: migration and language revitalization. Of course, it's not either or, it's both, but we will talk more about that, see more about that later. However, we can't get to the source of this specific question directly because census data doesn't exist that asks speakers where they're from, where they were born or they grew up, or whether they attended Gaelic medium education. Those questions don't exist on the census. There's been surveys that have tried to get at some of this, but nothing sort of robust at a national level, to my knowledge. So background. As I mentioned, Scottish Gaelic was once spoken throughout most of Scotland, but over time we've seen this loss over the country. With the primary speakers over the last century being really in the rural Northwest. But Glasgow itself has not been continuously Gaelic speaking since the mid 14th century. Yet, interestingly enough, we see that that Glasgow is home to almost 10,000 Gaelic speakers. And that represents almost 11% of them nationwide. And so we're gonna look into that source, whether it's the migration from starting in the 17th century or the more recent since the 1985, the Gaelic medium education. However, within Glasgow, it's still Gaelic speakers is still a relatively small proportion of that. So you have a little over 500,000 people living in Glasgow proper, but Gaelic speakers are a little over 1.5% of the total population. So here are a couple maps, and I'm going to escape so that I can zoom in to some of these maps. So I'm going to direct your attention to this one on the left first. What you're seeing here is you're seeing all of Scotland with this color ramp here on the left as a percentage of Gaelic speakers within that specific council area, right? So you see this Northwest, this Gaeltacht region really popping out in this red or darker red. It's kind of hard to distinguish the two levels, but certainly the highest population are the folks in the Outer Hebrides. But the rest of the Gaeltacht has relatively higher percentage, ranging from anywhere from a little over 7% to 60%. With substantially fewer percentages found throughout the rest of the country, but for the exception of these three cities. So if you look at Glasgow, I'm going to zoom in because I did this to myself and I overlaid too many points here with the schools, but the Gaelic medium schools. But you can see Glasgow here is in orange, sort of beyond these points here. Edinburgh is in this dark orange as well, and Aberdeen, right? So you see that these cities are, sort of stand out compared to their neighbors as having, more Gaelic speakers as a percentage of the total population. Now let's look at this over time. Let's look at this over the course of several censuses. So that's what you see here in the map to the right. You see change in the Gaelic speakers within council area between 1991 and 2011. So the way to think about this is the shift of distribution of Gaelic speakers between this time frame. So when you look at this teal, this represents the overall net decrease of Gaelic speakers over that time period. And that's why you get the negative values. If you look at the magenta here, this represents the the net increase of speakers over those censuses. And keep in mind, this is sort of a shift of a population throughout Scotland as a whole. So sort of where the speakers have, the concentrations of speakers have moved to. And the greatest decreases you see have been in the Gaeltacht, right? With a net decrease for both these regions. But interestingly enough, the places that popped up with the highest net increase have been in these cities. So this kind of puts into perspective what we've been talking about as it relates to the increase in the cities over this time. So we talked about one of the sources being Gaelic medium education, right? So what is Gaelic medium education? For a lot of us, we're familiar with this. For those who aren't, this is an immersive instruction of all or nearly all of subjects through the medium of Gaelic. So this isn't like a bilingual model. This is where you're learning science, or you're learning history, you're learning math, all within the medium of Gaelic, as well as Gaelic, for the exception of other languages, which you would learn in those respective languages. And it's proven to be effective, both in terms of qualitatively and quantitative data. So founded in 1985, Gaelic medium education has seen a growth of enrollment. So if you look at the 2014 to 2015 school year, the nationwide enrollment was a little over 3,000, which represents about 1% of all the students, which is pretty small, but we can see the noticeable difference over time through the census data. We see an indication that it's having success. So while there's been a decrease of Gaelic speakers as a net whole over the last two censuses, 2001 and 2011, we can actually see some interesting changes. So if you look at, here we have this table, and you can see the censuses from 1981, 1991, and 2001. And you can see that if we compare 1981 to 1991 data, we have the number of Gaelic speakers here for 1981, and we see the Gaelic speakers for 1991, and you can see the change of the number of speakers as a negative value, indicating the decrease of speakers. But if we compare that against 1991 to 2001, we see that decrease is shrinking. We see that also between 2001 and 2011, where we're at the stage where we're almost seeing a no net decrease of loss. And I would suspect that the census that's coming out this year, 2022, or rather 2023 is when the data will be released. They're conducting the census this year. I would suspect that we would perhaps even see a net increase just by the trends. And specifically, we see a net increase already between these years from the ages of 5 to 19. So within that age group, we're seeing a net increase. And so that's where we're expecting to see the greatest growth over time. So let's talk a little bit about geolinguistics and GIS. So geolinguistics examines the historical and contemporary distributional patterns and geospatial structure of language, right? So we know that language changes over time, but also over space, and also within societal groups, right? And there's a strong tradition of using geography for the historical study of Scottish Gaelic, especially by scholars like Charles Withers. I think his first name is Charles. And geographic information systems is an interdisciplinary field that utilizes data-based technology for the storage and analysis and visualization of geospatial data. But in some fields of linguistics, we haven't seen it be utilized to some of its full potential. And one of these areas is revitalization. Dialectology has certainly used GIS, and but some other fields have room to grow, and that's sort of where I'm trying to look at this question for Scottish Gaelic. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about terminology. So the census asks several questions. It asks whether respondents A, speak, B, understand, C, read, and or D, write, or if they have no Gaelic skills. And these are sort of a set of questions that they aggregate within the census itself. So some of the questions will say, can speak but not read or write, or can understand but cannot speak. And so I'm working with all of these sets of parameters. However, there's no question on proficiency. So to what level do speakers speak or understand or what have you, or when or where they learned the language. Did they learn it as a kid? Did they learn it as an adult? Did they learn it in school? Did they learn it, by traditional means? So what I don't want to do, which we sometimes see it quantified in the literature, I don't want to just necessarily focus on just those who speak. I want to sort of think about everybody who's involved in the Gaelic language. We know there's a lot of people who have great understanding, comprehension of the language, but may underreport their speaking skills or may not feel that themselves are a speaker, or those who grew up in the traditional method but were excluded from reading or writing from it in school, and I don't want them to be excluded either. So what we're doing is I'm taking a summation of all the people who responded positively to A, B, C, and or D. So it doesn't have to be that they responded to all of them, just to at least one of them. And that is what that's the universe of the people. So it'll include more than just, speakers in the sense of the census. It'll include everybody who responded affirmatively to any of those questions. So the way that I actually do this is I take the total number of people within a given geographical area that's reported, and I just subtract E, no Gaelic skills, which actually gives me the same number. It's just a little bit easier to compute in the database. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm calling this universe of people that that have some sort of connection with speaking, understanding, reading, and or writing the language as a Luch na Gaelic, which is it translates as the people of the Gaelic language. And this is sort of a term that Cloud has used in the literature. And I hope I'm not utilizing it in a way that he did not intend, but I think this gets at it in the maybe perhaps the most effective way possible. So that's the term I'm going to be used throughout the rest of this talk, and and you know what it refers to. So the total number of the Luch na Gaelic in Scotland in 2011 was 87,000. So that's why you're seeing that number a little bit higher than the 50-some thousand of speakers. Okay. So let's take a look at the research question and the hypothesis. So first, what demographics variables correlate with the Luch na Gaelic in the urban setting within Glasgow in both 2011 and 2011, right? What are the factors that predict their distribution? And are they the same? Do they change over time? Also, we want to look at the question of Gaelic medium education. Do the locations of the Gaelic medium education schools predict where you find Luch na Gaelic? In other words, do we find sort of people with connections to the language closer to these schools? So my hypotheses are that from some of the literature before that has looked at people that tend to speak the language growing up in the GME schools, they tend to go on to higher education. There's also a greater number of people who are born outside of Scotland who learn through the GME method in the urban settings. And then also looking at the variable of full-time students. These are the things that I think will have a positive correlation with Gaelic speakers in the urban setting, in the Glasgow setting. Those that have and then I hypothesize a couple that will have negative correlation. For example, low education and distance away from GMA school, right? The further the distance from GME, I predict the fewer people that you'll find that are in the category of Luke Gaelic. Okay, so let's take a look at the data. Data was downloaded in two area types, both Glasgow Council area, which encompasses the entire city and some of the surrounding areas, as well as data zones. And you can think of council areas like perhaps like maybe analogous to counties in the US, maybe something like Maricopa County, which encompasses a lot of the city. And I use this to clip out Glasgow, the Glasgow data. The data zones are the smallest geographic unit for the range of data that was available and provides information on sort of the interior of Glasgow. And each of these data zones have approximately 500 to 1,000 household residents. So this, if you know about the census tracts, this is actually a bit smaller, perhaps half the size of a census tract. So you're getting very high resolution, as we talk about in GIS, data from looking at the data zones. So I download what are called shape files from the Scotland census. They make everything nicely available and free, which is great for us graduate students and scholars working in these areas. And I downloaded these files, these shape files, which are just geographic coordinate data. These are polygonal boundaries, basically, for all these data zones, as well as the census numerical values that plug in for each of these data zones. Right? We'll look at that. Additionally, I had previously compiled a list of Gaelic medium education schools, and I was able, to the extent that it is exhaustive, I'm not entirely sure, but I used sort of the best available data that I could find on the internet. And I found XY coordinates for each of the schools throughout the country, but of course we're focusing on Glasgow here. And I plot these on the map to see if they correlate with Gaelic speakers. So lastly, I collected comparable census data for both 2001 and 2011. So I went through a lot of work to find out which variables were significant for both censuses, and you'll see that a little bit later. But ultimately, the tables that I downloaded and plugged into the database were things that related to country of birth, economic activity, education level, Gaelic language skills, social grade. That's sort of like socioeconomic status on our side. And what's really wonderful is that the Scotland census allows us to download this data for 2011, but retaining the boundary data for 2001. So in other words, this data zone boundaries change among censuses, just like they do here in the US, which can make it hard to compare from one to another. But because the census allows you to choose if you want them in the newer polygonal data or the older polygonal data, we can choose to do the older one. And that way we compare apples to apples as far as the boundaries are concerned. We can see if these factors are becoming more predictable over time. So, and I'm using ArcGIS Pro for the geospatial analysis, including the ordinary least squares regression, which is a regression that's often used within geographic context, geospatial analysis context. And I'm using the software also for the visualization of the maps. So let's take a look at the results. So in order to determine which demographic variables correlate with Gaelic, this Luke na Gaelic, right? I performed this OLS regression on these data zones using the following variables. So my dependent variable was this number of the folks who are considered Luke na Gaelic as a percentage of the total local population. So for each of these data zones, I'm calculating that. And then my independent variables are the individuals with level 1 education which corresponds to roughly high school within the American context, those who have achieved high school education. And then I'm also looking at the percentage of individuals with level 4 education. So this is post-baccalaureate as their highest education. So I'm sort of seeing bookends of that education spectrum. I'm also looking at percentage of people born outside of Scotland. So why am I doing that? Well, certainly the idea is that we would predict that folks who are, who identify as having a connection to the Gaelic language, whether it's speaking, understanding, reading, or writing, right, who weren't born in Scotland, then those are folks that we could confidently say that they certainly didn't learn it within the Gaeltacht and migrated, right? That these are probably immigrant communities who were enrolled in GME. And the literature has lots of case studies and examples of folks within that category. I'm also looking at percentage of full-time students. So the idea is there's probably a correlation of more, full-time students with those folks who are studying Gaelic and going on to further education. And then, of course, distance to GME school. So here, for those who are more interested in these levels of what they call qualification levels, and it's just level of education or training in the trades, for example, you can see the level 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. I won't go into it in detail. Some of it is some of it's technical, and and it's sort of filled with specific designations within UK and Scotland, but you can kind of see just a sketch of what some of those different levels look like. Okay, so let's start with Glasgow 2011. Well, here is my regression table from the OLS. It turned out that all of the variables that I looked at turned out to be significant. In other words, we do see a connection between these variables and the distribution of Gaelic, Gaelic. Here's a few ways of looking at this table. First of all, you'll see that you have the variables, so the distance to the GME. We predict that that's going to have a negative correlation, and that makes sense because we predict that the higher the number, which indicates the further away you are from GME, the fewer speakers you're going to find. So that's why it's negative. And indeed, the probability, we do see that as significant. We see a negative correlation with level 1 education, and that's significant as well. We see a positive correlation with level 4 education. We see a positive correlation with those born outside of Scotland and those who are full-time students. Now, a few other things about this table. So if you look at this number over here, this is the VIF, and because none of them exceed 7.5, we can confidently say that we're not getting collinearity among these effects. In other words, we're not sort of, if you look at education, for example, sometimes that correlates with, higher income or what have you. And so sometimes you have two variables saying the same story, but those have been eliminated out of here. We can confidently say that all these variables are indeed significant and they're not collinear. Collinear is not being an issue that rather. There's also this Conquer statistic that just because that is significant, we are going to be using what's called a robust probability. And that's something that's calculated through the software. So you'll see both probability and robust probability. And as long as this is significant, which it is for the rest of this talk, then we're just going to be focused on robust probability. However, that's all the sort of good news, right? Now let's take a look at some of the limitations. First of all, you can see the adjusted R squared value is 0.45. So we're capturing a good chunk of the distribution of Luke Gaelic throughout Glasgow, but there's a lot of variables that I haven't factored in here, and that's why that value we'd like to see that higher. Moreover, if you look at this, I don't know if it's pronounced Jarka, this statistic here, because this is significant, then within the statistical lingo, the results are considered biased, and that tells us that there's missing variables. It means that we're not capturing all the variables that associate with the distribution of Luke Gaelic. And that also prevents us from doing a geographic weighted regression. But this gets us, because we are seeing that these variables are significant, we are seeing that this is a model that is capturing at least some of, good chunk of the distribution. Okay, so, and we can see this geospatially as well. So here we have a map of Glasgow, right? And you can see the Clyde River here and everything. And you'll see that there's a color ramp here on the left-hand side. And this basically just represents the average maximum education level throughout the city of Glasgow. And the values correspond with level 1 to level 4, right? So you see the yellow representing those areas with the relatively lower education level as an average, and the areas with the red indicating they're relatively higher. And so you can see and then you also see with these little circles, right, throughout the city. And that represents the percentage of folks who are in this category of Luke Gaelic as a percentage of the total local population. So it's all normalized throughout per data zone throughout the city. And these are data zones. That's what these little geographies are, these boundaries are. So you can see that the smaller circles indicate relatively lower percentages of Gaelic people with Gaelic folk, people with connections to the Gaelic language one way or another. And the bigger circles represent those areas with relatively higher percentages. Now, what's interesting is you see this area here in the middle with the relatively higher populations of Luke Gaelic, right? And there's a lot of you can see, additionally, you can see that there's Gaelic schools here in green, famous one right here, for example. The university is right in this area as well, and you see these purple icons. These are the Gaelic for adults education. I got that data generously provided to me by McLeod and colleagues. So what's interesting is you have this interesting overlap between higher education, folks with higher education, and those folks who are in this category of Luke Gaelic. And so you can see geospatially that in happening. Okay, but as I mentioned before, we have some limitations, and they're geospatial in nature as well. So just as we saw that our R square value is it's modestly okay, it's modestly good, but it's not great. And we can see that on the when we look at the plot of the regression throughout the entire city. So what this does is this basically just has standard deviations of the residuals throughout the entire city. And to put it better, wherever you see blue, that's where the model is underestimating the Luke Gaelic populations. Wherever you see red, it's where it's overestimating. And I believe I have those two things correct. So you can see when you see pockets of these red areas and pockets of these blue areas, it means that the model really is leaving out something in those areas that would explain some of the distribution that we're otherwise aren't capturing with the variables in our model right now. All right, so there's some variables that are noteworthy that we're still looking for, and I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts about that. You can kind of see where those areas are. But generally speaking, this plot, you would like to see it have random distribution. If it was random, in other words, if we didn't see clustering like we are right now, then that means that that the variables would be accounting for it rather than having what's called autocorrelation, which means that we're getting this geographic clustering of variables that we're not accounting for yet. All right, so we looked at the table for 2011. Now we're going to compare that to 2001. This is interesting. So first of all, we're going to see that these variables, but with 2001 data, are also significant, right? Now remember, we're looking at the robust probability because conquer is significant. So even though you see this value, it's like, oh, that doesn't look so good, we can disregard this column and can look at the robust probability. And they're all significant. And they all have the same sorts of directions that we saw in the last one. Nothing's collinear. I've already eliminated all those sorts of variables. And but we'll see that the adjusted R-square value is a little bit less than the one that we saw for 2011. Now, you can't compare R-square value from one model to another just by that. That never makes sense, but this is the beauty about working with this data. Now recall that I was able to get the 2011 data, but within the polygons of 2001. Because of that, and because I'm using the same exact variables, I can compare between the two models using the AIC. Especially because I'm using the same dependent variable. So you look at this AIC value here, 1959, right? Now, if I compare that to the AIC value of 2001, oh, I've got these flipped. These values are flipped. That was a typo on my part, but I'll just go to the table. So 1959, that's for 2001. Oh yeah, no, this is correct. So if you look at 1959 to 2001, you'll see that there's a significant drop in the AIC. And that gives us the determination because whenever you see a lower AIC, and I think lower by at least 3, that's sort of the benchmark. Whenever you have a lower AIC, that means an improvement in the model. So we do see over time, and you can see that, to the extent that we can compare our values, which you really can't, but you can see that even the R-square values, there's an increase over time as well. This means that this model with all these same variables and all these same geographies is getting more predictive over time. And that squares with the fact that in the cities, we're seeing the GME schools having success in training in helping folks in teaching the Gaelic language, and all those variables that correlate with that, whether it be education or those folks born outside of the UK or what have you, we're seeing that those are accounting for more and more Lugna Gaelic over time. So then we have this sort of larger research question that we've been trying to get at. We've been kind of dancing around for a while. To what extent can the rise of Lugna Gaelic in cities be attributed to the migration from the Gaeltacht or from Gaelic revitalization, like GME? Now, the important thing is we don't have what's consider cross-tabulated data for Lugna Gaelic, except for two variables. We can look for folks who responded affirmatively to those Gaelic questions by sex and by age, or by sex and age. Okay. And I think age has some interesting insight into this question. So here's the assumption I'm having. Where the age of the Lugna Gaelic matches the age of the general population, or better put, when they are younger, those are more likely, those folks probably learned it out of GME, because GME has only been around since 1985. And we've seen more and more people enrolling over time. That people those younger folks in Glasgow, I don't think it's a stretch to say that they probably learned it through GME, and not necessarily through migration or through the traditional means. Whereas the older groups, older Lugna Gaelic, likely grew up with the language. So here is Glasgow again, and here I have a different color ramp. So what this is this is the color ramp only represents those folks who are in the category of Lugna Gaelic. But what I have here is I have their age plotted out. So you can see the range of age, and it's a nice range, right? Stretching all the way from 30 to 75. Now, what's interesting is you see that the same, and then you also have the proportional circles representing what they represented before. This percentage of folks who are Lugna Gaelic per the local population. Now, what's interesting is that you look at that same area, sort of with this clustering of Lugna Gaelic, right, that we saw before, sort of north of Clyde. And we see that there's an interesting divide between these areas with relatively older Lugna Gaelic and these areas with relatively younger. And I think this corresponds very well with the university being here and a lot of other, GME programs and everything like that. But this is from the 2011 census, and this was a mere 26 years after GME was established. So when you look at these folks on the higher ends, 55 or 75, sort of on this area, then it's doubtful that those age groups would have been learning Gaelic through GME. It's a lot more likely that the younger folks would have been learning it. So what we might be seeing here is that divide that we've been looking for in the literature of who learned it through migration or who learned it in the schools. Especially when you're talking about some folks who, some of their ages are in retirement, and they must have migrated. I would assume. Okay. So in conclusion, returning to my hypothesis, the following variables had a positive correlation: high education, people born outside of Scotland, and full-time students. These were all true predictions. And the variables that had a negative correlation: low education or distance to GME, these also turned out to be true. They had a negative correlation. And the model improved over time, indicating that these variables have become more predictive for the Lugna Gaelic over time. The fact that the level 4 education was correlated with Lugna Gaelic is suggestive that students may have learned it through GME, as students from those programs tend to go on to higher levels of education. And we've seen that talked about in the literature. And this is further confirmed by the fact that full-time students is positively correlated with level 1 education is negatively correlated. Furthermore, distance to GME was inversely correlated with Lugna Gaelic, meaning that those folks resided closer to the schools. And this is consistent with Lugna Gaelic learning through those GME programs. Lastly, there was a positive correlation between people born outside of Scotland and Lugna Gaelic in Glasgow, which, as far as I can tell, can only be explained by relatively larger numbers of people learning it in schools, and not through the traditional means, sort of through intergenerational transmission. The study has highlighted the use of GIS for language endangerment and the success and looking at the successes of language instruction of Scottish Gaelic. The urban Luachna Gaelic tend to have those higher levels of education, are full-time students, live closer to the schools, and tend to be, there at least more of them tend to be born outside of Scotland. And this can be explained by those greater numbers of Gaelic speakers having learned the language through the schools, as opposed to the rural Northwest, as I mentioned before. While this paper does not ultimately solve the question on how many urban Luachna Gaelic are products of migration or education, it does suggest that the latter plays a significant role in this current situation of urban Luachna Gaelic. These are all the people I'd like to thank, including a lot of folks who are present here today. And I thank all of you very much. Thank you.
John, I'm going to let you, thank you, John. That was fascinating. I'm going to let you run your own question period because the noise here is
noise. Happy
there's
to.
lots and lots and lots of questions in the chat.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll just kind of scroll up to thank you, Andrew, for the note there. I appreciate that. All right, it looks like Mike, you have a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask that?
Can I defer to the students first?
Sure, absolutely. All right, Sam, I see that you had a question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this talk. It was really interesting, and I just every time I get to see new geolinguistics stuff, it's very exciting to me, and I just want to keep seeing it. My first question was maybe a little bit incidental. It was just about the born outside of Scotland folks. If you knew when they had arrived, how old they were when they arrived, or how long they had been in the country. If you thought that might be a factor, but I don't know if it's specified to that level. Just an incidental question.
Very good question. And from the census data, unfortunately, I cannot tell, but from quantitative studies, there's been people who have looked at this sort of question, and you may have, for example, folks from Punjab, for example, who migrate to Scotland, and they enroll their children into the Gaelic programs, and but unfortunately, from the data itself, there's just that sort of data is not one of the outputs that the census does provide, unfortunately. But it's very, very directly would be directly great to have, because it would really speak to those folks for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And then D.
So my census data that's going to be released next year is obviously going to our COVID time. And I was wondering what you thought, because as we've all seen, like the schools have been really stinted. And I was actually living in the UK when the COVID started, and then so I have kind of an idea of similar things going on over there. But also there was a lot of people reconnecting with like their cultural heritage and languages. And so I was just, it's kind of a toss-up. I was wondering what you thought maybe the impact of that might be on that new data, and how it would maybe skew these lovely graphs and lovely maps that you've made.
That's a very good question, and it's certainly something the new census that's coming out has certainly been on my mind, and I can't wait to be able to look into that next year. But I think the interesting points that you bring up could explain. It could definitely, if there is some interesting departures from trends that we're seeing, that could definitely be an explanation. I don't know what the situation looks like for, what the instruction looked like during COVID, when that sort of returned to in person, and what it looks like now. I imagine by now, all those programs are all up and running. But there was, certainly that disruption, and we've seen that effect in the American context. We've seen that affect the test scores and everything like that. So, I'm going to think about that a lot. And I'll keep that in mind when I'm looking at that. Thank you. All right. I think the next question I have here is, hold on a second. I think the next question, Ellie, it looks like, I think you're the next question.
She's gone.
Oh, yes, yes.
So we go to Kevin next, actually.
Okay, there we go. Kevin.
Okay, a few quick different points. The number of Gaelic schools in Glasgow has been increasing. There's one, the School Gaelic Glasgow is the main one, primary and secondary, but there's now 3 or maybe going on to 4. So I don't know whether you had to take that into account. For the location of Gaelic speakers who came in from the Western Isles, maybe you could look at previous censuses. The geographic resolution wouldn't be so good, but it would tell you where they were. They certainly used to be concentrated in Partick and Govan, but then they'll have moved out sort of 60s, 70s. The COVID thing, this is more recent, but I've got a friend who teaches as a secondary school teacher and outside Glasgow, and her daughter is in Gaelic medium education in Glasgow, and the Gaelic schools is quality, and they kept going through COVID, and she was kept busy, whereas the school where the mother teaches is not such good quality, and they get no response from the pupils. The main thing, though, I had to say was an interesting anecdote. It was in the early 2000s. There was a bill in the Scottish Parliament, I think the first bill to support Gaelic, and it went out to consultation from different bodies and public. And the Welsh Race Relations Board wrote in saying this is a good thing. And the Scottish Race Relations Board put in opposing it because it would be discriminatory against people from outside Scotland. So I took a look at the government website where the 2001 census was, and it had everything tabulated against everything else. So it had ethnic origin and age tabulated against the proportion speaking Gaelic. And the fact that jumped out, people of Chinese ethnic origin, the children, 5 to 15-year-olds, the proportion speaking Gaelic was double the Scottish average. And in South Asian, India, Pakistan sort of thing, it was 1.7 times the Scottish average. And somebody at Seoul Morostic who'd spent years in China had a reason for it. She said most of the Chinese population of Scotland is in Glasgow, where there's an excellent Gaelic school. They're mad keen in education. The only good school you have a chance of getting your children into is the Gaelic school, which is why they send them there. And I would maybe add to that if you already speak English and another language, then it's no big deal to go to a Gaelic school, whereas a lot of British people have a phobia against other languages. Anyway, that's a whole load of comments.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That's very, very insightful, very interesting. Yeah, I wasn't aware about sort of some of these situations, and I'll definitely think about that a lot. The thing about looking at the rural side as well, I haven't looked at it over time, sort of within the Gaeltacht, seeing sort of the shift of speakers or sort of the movement. Other than that, sort of at a larger scale, looking at the council areas, but looking at the data zones, I think would be very informative. And then maybe those sorts of correlations with different variables would be insightful on that way too, to get at the migration question. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Okay. I think the last one, we have just enough time for Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
So I love this stuff, still love this stuff. So one question I had, which I think it connects to several that I asked, was about the relationship between the location of the schools and the kids that attend. And I guess I mean, like if you tried to do that in the US, right? Kids in the US go to schools all around town, right? Because it's very typical in the US for a kid to take a bus to school, right?
Right.
And I think that's true in many US cities. What's the situation in Glasgow? Do kids, are they expected or mostly go to a school in the neighborhood? Or do kids routinely take a bus or a train or something to go to school? Right. If it's the latter, then the distance correlations are a little messier. So do we know?
I don't have a good answer for that. There may be folks here who have a better answer for that than I do.
I think in the UK in general, for ordinary schools, you've got no choice. You have to go to the school in your neighbourhood. But the Gaelic schools, a lot of them would be travelling in by bus or train. I'm not sure what the rules are about whether you get supported by the local authorities or whether the parents, maybe if you're further away, then you have to pay yourself. But
that does suggest that if they're bussed in, you could actually perhaps get information about where those buses are coming from, which would then give you additional data. What neighborhoods these buses are heading out to, to pull the kids in.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So there's a couple ways that I can think about this question. First, we have the main Gaelic school there in the city, but you have a lot of these other ones too. So is it the fact that families might move closer to schools to enroll their kids in? And that's that can happen in a lot of different contexts. Or when they plan the locations of these schools, do they look for where there's already families speaking it? So what are we measuring here? And that's a very interesting question. And I think I could probably get at that question by doing perhaps interviews with folks who plan out these sorts of the rollouts of these schools and see what sort of factors they looked into, in addition to what you're saying about bus routes. I mean, if I would, generally speaking, I think, people are always going to try to be as close as possible if it's really important for their kids to be enrolled in those schools, or they'll enroll them out of convenience of already being in the location. Like, well, we have these two options. As Kevin said, the Gaelic schools have this great quality education that's not always clear, for, some of the other areas perhaps. And yeah, it's something for me to think about.
Sorry, I think there's a generalization for US schools. If you look in the public schools and you look at the magnet schools,
right?
And the magnet schools are the ones that, have some special attraction, right? I think the magnet schools tend to be in the crappiest neighborhoods. So it's almost as if there's an inverse correlation between quality of education and location for US schools. Right, because of the way magnet schools are determined. They take some underperforming school, they give it additional resources, make it a magnet school, and then kids will come to it. I don't think that, it doesn't sound like that's what's going on in the Scottish situation, but it does suggest that one has to be, and you are, of course, sophisticated about these distance measures, because these other factors could be quite striking.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, working with census data even on that side is painting with broad strokes, right? Self-reported, depends on how it's asked. It depends on, we're interpreting things that can mean a lot of different, things to different people, like, whether you speak a language, right? So yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's too good.